Everything Happens for a Reason. Introduction. In the introduction of Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I've Loved, Kate Bowler opens her memoir with a gripping and deeply personal revelation. At the age of 35, with a husband she loves and a young son she adores, and a promising career as a professor at Duke Divinity School, she is suddenly and unexpectedly diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. The shocking diagnosis throws her into a world of uncertainty, pain, and profound existential questioning. Having built her academic life around the study of the prosperity gospel, a theology that suggests that with enough faith, positivity, and good behavior one can secure health, wealth, and happiness, Kate now finds herself on the opposite side of that belief system, facing the terrifying reality that life can be random, unfair, and cruel, regardless of how good or faithful a person is. The irony of her situation isn't lost on her. She had spent years studying people who believed God would reward their faith with health and success, and now she was dying despite her faith, her good life, and her deep love for God. This contradiction lies at the heart of her book. In the introduction, Bowler uses her characteristic wit, honesty, and gentle sarcasm to begin unraveling the illusion of control that many people cling to in times of crisis. She introduces the idea that platitudes like, "everything happens for a reason," are often ways people try to comfort themselves, or others, in the face of suffering, even though such phrases can oversimplify or even invalidate the real pain and chaos people experience. Bowler makes it clear from the beginning that this book is not about offering easy answers or spiritual cliches. Instead, it is about sitting with the difficult questions, embracing the uncertainty, and making peace with a world where not everything makes sense. She touches on how people often approach those with illness or tragedy not with compassion, but with unsolicited advice, spiritual one-liners, or even subtle blame, suggesting that if something bad happened, it must be because of some hidden reason or flaw. In this sense, Bowler begins to gently confront and dismantle the lies she once loved. Those neat, tidy beliefs that suffering can be explained or earned, that everything fits into a divine plan if we're just good enough. Through her powerful narrative voice, she offers readers a space to breathe, to feel seen, and to acknowledge that sometimes life is heartbreaking without reason, and that naming that truth is not only healing but holy. The introduction also sets the tone for the rest of the memoir, a blend of deep theological insight, emotional vulnerability, dark humor, and fierce love. Bowler invites the reader into her personal experience not just to witness her story but to reflect on their own beliefs about suffering, faith, and what it means to live fully, even in the shadow of death. Her reflections are not purely academic, despite her scholarly background. They are intimate, embodied, and painfully real. She shares how cancer disrupted not only her body but her sense of self, her relationships, and her previously held ideas about God and goodness. The introduction doesn't offer resolution. It isn't meant to. Instead, it opens a door to a raw and honest conversation about mortality, meaning, and the very human desire to make sense of the senseless. Bowler doesn't promise to answer why bad things happen to good people. She doesn't try to explain God's plan or find a silver lining in her suffering. What she offers instead is her presence, her honesty, and her willingness to speak openly about what it feels like to watch life unravel. Through her story, she begins to challenge the reader to consider how we respond to the pain of others, and how we might do better by being more present, more compassionate, and less quick to fix. The introduction is not just the beginning of her story but a challenge to a culture that often worships at the altar of self-help, control, and certainty. It's a call to be okay with not being okay, and to find grace in the midst of mess. In her quiet, humorous, and piercing way, Kate Bowler uses her own suffering to invite us to look more honestly at our own lives and beliefs, and to find beauty not in neat answers, but in love that stays, even when everything falls apart. Chapter 1. Diagnosis. In Chapter 1, titled Diagnosis, Kate Bowler recounts the moment her world was split in two by a life-altering phone call that delivered the news: she had stage 4 colon cancer. At just 35 years old, with a fulfilling academic career, a devoted husband, and a baby boy she adored, Kate was living a life that, by all appearances, was just beginning to flourish. The chapter opens with a description of the ordinariness of her life, the way her days were filled with diaper changes, faculty meetings, small joys, and a sense of purpose. And then abruptly, cruelly, that normalcy was shattered. She takes the reader into the surreal, almost out-of-body experience of receiving a terminal diagnosis, showing how time seemed to bend and crack, how every thought and every breath became saturated with fear, disbelief, and grief. In her signature style, combining humor and poignancy, Kate captures the strange duality of her situation. She is a scholar of religion, someone who has spent years analyzing how people find meaning in suffering, and yet, faced with her own tragedy, she finds herself unmoored, suspended between life and death, certainty and chaos. Her medical symptoms, abdominal pain, exhaustion, strange physical signals, had been brushed aside for months, first by herself and then by doctors who couldn't believe someone so young could be so sick. The reality only became undeniable when the evidence could no longer be ignored. Scans, blood tests, and the cold, clinical confirmation that cancer had spread through her body. The news didn't just wreck her body, it cracked open her mind and spirit. She invites the reader into the fragile space of that diagnosis, the slow-motion collapse of everything she thought she knew about her future, her body, and even her faith. As a theologian who had spent years studying the prosperity gospel, a belief system that says faith can protect you from suffering, Kate now faced the raw, horrifying truth that life doesn't always reward good behavior, and that bad things happen to good people for no discernible reason. The idea that she could no longer outrun tragedy by working hard, being a good person, or clinging tightly to her faith left her reeling. The chapter explores this spiritual and emotional disorientation as she begins to grieve not only the possible end of her life but the loss of the story she had written for herself. A long life with her husband, watching her son grow up, writing books, building a legacy. She is painfully honest about the emotional mess of those first days after the diagnosis. The irrational fears, the awkward conversations, the flood of "what now?" questions that offer no satisfying answers. Bowler uses this chapter to not only tell her personal story but to illuminate something universally human, the illusion of control that so many of us live under, the false security that comes from planning our lives carefully, and the belief that if we just follow the rules, we'll be spared from suffering. The diagnosis ripped away that illusion in a single moment. And yet, even as she plunges into this terrifying new reality, Kate doesn't wallow. She reflects with compassion and dark humor on the reactions of people around her, the awkward silence, the pitiful stares, and the often misguided attempts to comfort her with religious clichés or medical optimism. Through her storytelling, she lays bare how vulnerable people with serious illness become, not just physically but emotionally and socially, as the world doesn't quite know what to do with them. There's a deep sense of loneliness that creeps into this chapter, not just from the fear of death, but from the knowledge that her former life is now inaccessible, and even the people closest to her can't fully follow her into this new, uncertain territory. The chapter doesn't rush toward hope or answers. Instead, it dwells honestly in the mess, allowing the reader to feel the full weight of Kate's emotional experience. Her writing is sharp and insightful, punctuated by moments of levity that make the sorrow even more striking. She captures the strange beauty in small details, her son's innocent joy, the comfort of her husband's presence, the surreal absurdity of life continuing as normal even as she faces a deadly illness. Throughout the chapter, Bowler subtly begins to challenge the toxic positivity and spiritual bypassing that often accompany illness narratives. She makes clear that being diagnosed with terminal cancer didn't make her wiser or more spiritually enlightened overnight. It made her scared, angry, confused, and deeply human. This refusal to tie up her story with neat bows or false hope becomes a powerful theme not just in this chapter but throughout the book. Instead of offering redemption or silver linings, Kate offers presence, her honest, vulnerable presence, and invites the reader to join her there. She speaks frankly about mortality, about the pain of imagining her son growing up without her, about the heartbreak of realizing that some dreams will never be fulfilled. But she also acknowledges the clarity that comes with being forced to look death in the face. The stripping away of pretense, the sharp focus on what matters, and the deep, fierce love that often blooms in the shadow of loss. By the end of the chapter, the diagnosis is not just a medical fact. It has become a spiritual and emotional crucible, burning away everything that isn't essential and leaving behind only raw, brutal truth. And yet, despite, or maybe because of, this truth, Kate's voice carries with it a quiet strength, a refusal to give in to despair, and a radical honesty that prepares the reader for the journey ahead. Chapter 1 sets the tone for the rest of the book by showing that this isn't a story about triumph over illness, but a meditation on what it means to live with courage and grace in the middle of devastation. It's about learning to carry grief and hope in the same hand and finding meaning not in the reason why something happens, but in how we respond to it with love. Chapter 2. The Prosperity Gospel. Kate Bowler takes a reflective and deeply personal dive into the belief system she had spent her academic career studying and in many ways quietly admiring, the prosperity gospel. This theology, widespread especially in North American evangelical circles, asserts that God rewards faithfulness, positive thinking, and moral living with health, wealth, and success, creating a spiritual formula in which suffering can be avoided if one just believes enough, prays the right way or has the right attitude. As a scholar, Kate had immersed herself in researching and writing about this movement, having even published a well-received book on the subject. And while she never fully subscribed to its teachings, she confesses in this chapter that she did find comfort, even hope, in its underlying logic, that life was a system she could manage, a divine equation where good behavior plus hard work would equal blessing. In the face of her cancer diagnosis, however, that system collapsed completely, and this chapter becomes her reckoning with the realization that she had subconsciously absorbed more of the prosperity gospel's promises than she had ever intended. She lays bare the human desire for control, for assurance that if we just do everything right, we will be protected from disaster, and how this belief can infiltrate even the most well-intentioned faith. Kate writes with raw honesty about how, as her own health unraveled, so did the quiet belief she'd held in the fairness of the world. She no longer saw herself as the academic observer of this theology. Now she was caught in the tension between its seductive promises and its brutal failure in the face of real-life tragedy. This chapter is not just a theological analysis. It's an emotional confession of how deeply she wanted the prosperity gospel to be true, how much she wished that her own suffering could be explained by a lack of faith, or fixed by praying harder, eating cleaner, or thinking more positively. She examines how this belief system thrives in American culture because it speaks to our deepest fears and desires: fear of death, of poverty, of insignificance, and desire for power, control, and safety. Through vivid storytelling and sharp insight, Kate illustrates how this gospel turns God into a kind of cosmic vending machine. Input the right coins of behavior and out comes blessing. She reveals the darker side of this theology, how it subtly blames the sick, the poor, and the grieving for their own misfortune, suggesting that if bad things happen, it must be due to a lack of faith or moral failure. She reflects on the ways she's seen this mindset show up not only in churches, but in everyday conversations in wellness culture, and even in how people responded to her own illness, offering unsolicited advice, miracle cures, or spiritual platitudes that masked a deeper discomfort with her suffering. Kate's writing is both sharp and compassionate as she wrestles with the dual truths that people often mean well when they offer these responses, but also that such responses can be cruel and isolating. The prosperity gospel, she explains, gives people a sense of control, but at a cost. It can make suffering feel like a personal failure and isolate those who are struggling. Bowler recounts how, in the early days of her diagnosis, she caught herself wondering if she had somehow brought this on herself, if she had missed a sign, ignored a symptom too long, or simply failed to be faithful enough. These thoughts, she admits, were not logical or theological. They were emotional reactions to the deep and terrifying feeling that the world no longer made sense. Her experience reveals how pervasive and seductive the prosperity gospel is, even for those who intellectually reject it. She discusses how it intersects with American ideals of individualism, achievement, and self-improvement, turning faith into a personal project of success and turning God into a coach or cheerleader rather than a companion in suffering. But as she reflects more deeply, Kate also begins to uncover the ways in which this belief system dehumanizes both God and people, reducing divine love to a transaction and reducing people's pain to a problem to be fixed. She acknowledges how tempting it is to search for reasons, to believe in divine fairness, because randomness is frightening and suffering without meaning feels unbearable. Yet in that very space, of unknowing, of grief, of broken systems, Kate begins to see a different kind of faith emerging, one that does not seek to control God or guarantee outcomes, but that learns to live honestly and tenderly with what is. She starts to realize that there is something holy in being present in suffering without trying to fix it, in learning to sit with grief rather than rush past it. This chapter is foundational to the book, because it marks the moment Kate truly begins to peel away the layers of theological certainty, exposing the fragile hopes that once gave her comfort but can no longer sustain her. The prosperity gospel, she concludes, is not just a fringe religious movement. It's a deeply embedded cultural reflex that teaches people to deny pain, hide weakness, and pursue perfection at all costs. But life as she is now experiencing is not a formula. It is mystery, full of love and loss, health and sickness, joy and sorrow, and no amount of faith can guarantee the outcome we want. What we are left with, in the absence of that certainty, is each other, and perhaps, in a quieter, humbler way, the presence of a God who does not promise to protect us from suffering, but to be with us in the middle of it. By the end of Chapter 2, Kate has not only deconstructed the prosperity gospel for the reader but also shown the painful, beautiful process of deconstructing it within herself. Her diagnosis forced her to confront the hidden expectations she had placed on God, on herself, and on life. And in letting go of those expectations she begins to glimpse a deeper, more enduring form of faith. one rooted not in control but in compassion, honesty and love that stays, even when everything else falls apart. Chapter 3 Lies I've Loved. Kate Bowler turns inward to examine not just the external belief system she once studied or passively accepted, but the deeply personal, often invisible convictions that she herself carried, the small, sweet-sounding lies that shaped her understanding of life, God, and fairness before her cancer diagnosis shattered them. These are not always grand theological positions, she explains, but quiet, cultural assumptions. That good things happen to good people, that hard work pays off, that suffering is always redemptive, and that with enough love, faith, or effort, anything can be fixed. She confesses that while she may have rejected the prosperity gospel formally, she still loved its emotional comforts. Those tidy promises that made the world seem predictable, manageable, even fair. In this chapter, Bowler exposes how she, like many of us, clung to these illusions not out of ignorance, but out of a very human need for order and reassurance. She discusses how these lies were woven into her upbringing, her faith, her education, and her culture, and how deeply ingrained they were in her psyche, so much so that even in the midst of a terminal illness, a part of her kept searching for what she had done wrong, what she could still do to fix her life and return to the world of health, normalcy, and certainty. With her signature mix of wit and vulnerability, Bowler offers examples of the types of platitudes and assumptions that had once brought her comfort. Sayings like, God has a plan, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and of course, everything happens for a reason. These are the lies she's loved because they offer the illusion that suffering is always purposeful, that every painful event has a hidden blessing or lesson waiting to be discovered, and that no matter what, life is unfolding according to a divine blueprint. But now, faced with her own fragile, limited life, she begins to see how these sayings, though often well-meaning, are not just untrue, they can be cruel. They suggest that if she can't find the reason for her pain, or if she isn't becoming a stronger or better person because of it, then she must be failing in some spiritual or moral way. She reflects on how people, friends, acquaintances, even strangers, offer these phrases in an attempt to soothe, to help, to explain the inexplicable, but they often end up doing more harm than good. Instead of comforting her, these words isolate her, making her feel like her suffering must serve some greater good in order to be valid or bearable. This chapter serves as both confession and critique, as Bowler gently but powerfully dismantles the false narratives we tell ourselves and others in an effort to avoid the raw truth of pain, randomness, and mortality. She talks about how people struggle to simply be present with suffering. Instead, they rush to offer explanations, to say something, anything, that will make the discomfort go away, even if it's not helpful. Kate makes the powerful point that these lies often protect not the sufferer, but the speaker. They shield others from having to feel helpless, from having to sit in silence and admit that sometimes there are no good answers. And yet, in admitting the hollowness of these once comforting ideas, Bowler doesn't become cynical or bitter. Rather, she leans into a more honest, compassionate way of being. She begins to see the beauty of truth-telling, the sacredness of people who show up without needing to fix her, who can sit beside her and simply say, "This is awful. I'm here." She starts to understand that presence, not platitudes, is what heals, not curing or comforting with clichés, but bearing witness to another's suffering without judgment or advice. Through her reflections, she invites readers to consider their own cherished lies, the beliefs they hold about suffering, success, and fairness, and how those beliefs may fall apart when tested by real tragedy. She also invites readers to notice the ways they respond to the suffering of others, not just with words but with posture, with presence, with quiet support rather than frantic explanations. By calling these beliefs lies I've loved, Bowler shows compassion even for her past self, the woman who desperately wanted the world to be simple, who wanted to believe in cause and effect, in divine logic, in happily ever afters. She does not shame herself or anyone else for needing that comfort. Instead, she gently guides herself and her readers toward a more mature, grounded faith, one that is less about answers and more about grace. The chapter ultimately becomes a meditation on the limits of human control, the futility of spiritual shortcuts, and the need for a faith that can hold up under real suffering. In her quiet, thoughtful way, Kate Bowler begins to model a new kind of belief, one that doesn't require her to make sense of her pain but allows her to be honest in the midst of it. She suggests that it is possible to love life even when it's unfair, to hold on to joy even in grief, and to experience God not as a distant planner or rewarder, but as a tender presence in the deepest darkness. In acknowledging the lies she once loved, Bowler opens space for a deeper truth to emerge, one rooted not in explanation but in love. And in doing so, she offers her readers the permission to grieve without guilt, to suffer without shame, and to let go of the need for life to always make sense. Chapter 4: Faith and Fear. Kate Bowler plunges into the tangled, paradoxical relationship between belief and terror, exploring how, in the wake of her cancer diagnosis, her once stable faith now wrestled with a fear so deep it lived in her bones, shadowing every moment with the possibility of death, separation, and loss. She begins this chapter by reflecting on how faith had always been a central part of her identity, not only as a Christian but as a scholar of religion, someone who had devoted her life to studying how belief systems give people meaning, comfort, and direction. But now, thrust into the chaos of a terminal illness, she found herself questioning not just what she believed, but how belief functions when life becomes uncertain, when prayers go unanswered, and when hope begins to feel like a dangerous thing to hold on to. Kate doesn't try to sanitize her fear. Instead, she gives it breath and shape, showing how it moved into her life like an unwelcome guest, present in the silence of her hospital room, in the waiting between test results, in the quiet moments rocking her toddler as she wondered if she would live to see him grow. Yet in the same breath, she also describes the strange resilience of faith, not as certainty or assurance, but as a flicker of presence, a hand to hold in the dark, a kind of sacred resistance to despair. She confesses that her faith, once neat and robust, now felt battered and quiet, less a shield and more a whisper, but it hadn't vanished. Instead, it had changed. Where once she might have believed that faith would protect her from suffering, now she saw that real faith often coexists with fear, that trust in God doesn't erase anxiety but allows us to walk through it without being consumed. Bowler speaks candidly about her internal struggle, the pull between wanting to believe in a God who could heal her and the painful awareness that healing might not come, that prayers don't always change outcomes and that miracles are rare. She reflects on how terrifying it is to love life so deeply, to love her son, her husband, her work, and yet know that all of it could be taken from her. This deep love, she realizes, is what fuels her fear. The more she cherishes life, the more she has to lose, and faith does not cancel out that terror. Instead, it teaches her to live in the tension between gratitude and grief, hope and realism. She also unpacks how the Christian tradition often misunderstands fear, treating it as a lack of faith or a moral failure, when in reality, fear is a natural and even holy response to the awareness of fragility, to the vulnerability of being human in a world where so much is beyond our control. She critiques the pressure many Christians feel to be relentlessly positive, to frame every hardship as part of God's plan, and to see faith as an antidote to pain, rather than a companion through it. Bowler shares moments of spiritual rawness, crying out to God in anger, pleading for more time, wondering if her suffering has meaning, and she finds in these broken prayers a deeper kind of intimacy with the divine. Faith, she realizes, doesn't always look like confidence. Sometimes it looks like hanging on by a thread, like sitting in silence when words fail, like showing up even when your heart is breaking. She speaks movingly about how her fear is not a sign that she has failed as a believer, but a sign that she is awake to the reality of her life, awake to the beauty of the world, the preciousness of time, and the love that saturates every relationship. That fear is not an enemy to be conquered but a teacher, showing her what she values most and forcing her to stay fully present in the moment, even when it hurts. In this chapter, Kate also reflects on how others respond to fear, how people often try to suppress it, deny it, or mask it with busyness, optimism, or denial, and how this avoidance can create isolation, especially for those facing real danger. She invites her readers to reframe fear not as a sign of weakness, but as part of what it means to be alive. And in doing so, she honors the experience of all who live with chronic illness, grief, or uncertainty, not by offering them false hope, but by offering solidarity. She writes not to offer answers but to create space for truth, to say, "Me too. I feel it too." Through it all, Bowler's faith remains, not loud or triumphant, but fierce in its gentleness, rooted in love rather than logic, in presence rather than proof. Her relationship with God becomes less about explanation and more about companionship. She finds comfort not in theology, but in the steady sense that she is not alone in her suffering. The God she clings to is not a distant orchestrator of her pain, but a God who weeps beside her, who bears witness to her agony, who does not always fix but always stays. This realization allows her to stop trying to be okay, to stop performing certainty, and instead embrace a deeper truth, that faith is not the opposite of fear, but its companion, its anchor. By the end of the chapter, Kate has not resolved the tension between faith and fear, but she no longer sees them as incompatible. She recognizes that to believe is not to be unafraid, but to choose love anyway, to keep showing up, to keep hoping, to keep loving fiercely, even when tomorrow is uncertain. In her most vulnerable moments, It is not theology or doctrine that sustains her, but the quiet presence of a faith that walks with her through the valley of the shadow of death, offering not escape but courage. And in that courage she finds a kind of peace, not the peace of having all the answers, but the peace of being known, of being held even in the midst of the storm. Chapter 5 Love in the Dark. Kate Bowler reflects with stunning vulnerability and poetic insight on the way love emerges, endures and transforms in the shadow of suffering, particularly when her life is overwhelmed by the darkness of terminal illness, fear, and the stripping away of future certainty. She begins by recognizing how, when everything familiar and secure is lost, her health, her sense of invincibility, her dreams for a long and ordinary life, the one thing that remains with clarity and power is love, raw and unfiltered. In the silence of hospital rooms, in the painful conversations with doctors, in the mundane moments of watching her son play or listening to her husband breathe beside her in bed, Kate experiences love not as a grand romantic notion, but as something fierce, grounded, and utterly necessary. She explores how love becomes most real not in celebrations or moments of ease, but in the tender, often uncomfortable spaces where life is most fragile and uncertain. When the future becomes unknowable, when her body feels like a betrayal, it is the presence of others, their willingness to stay to witness her pain without trying to fix it, to simply be there, that becomes the truest expression of love. She writes about how this kind of love often goes unnoticed in healthier times. The friend who shows up without fanfare, the nurse who takes extra time to ease her discomfort, the family member who calls just to listen. These acts, which once might have seemed small, now take on cosmic significance because they represent a kind of sacred solidarity, a refusal to abandon someone in their darkest hour. Kate doesn't idealize suffering, she doesn't pretend that pain automatically reveals meaning or makes people noble, but she acknowledges that in suffering the unnecessary layers of life are peeled away, and what's left is a deeper, almost primal connection between souls. She also examines the complicated ways love and pity can be confused, how people often express love in ways that stem from discomfort or fear, and how she has learned to distinguish between genuine care and the kind of help that seeks to make the helper feel better, rather than truly supporting the person who is suffering. There is a particular poignancy in how she describes receiving love while feeling like she has little to give back. How humbling, even disorienting, it is to be the one who needs help, the one who cannot contribute in the way she once did, the one who simply must receive. And yet, she begins to understand that there is a kind of grace in allowing others to love her, in accepting that love is not a transaction but a gift, freely given and no less valuable for being uneven. This realization challenges her former notions of self-worth, which were so tied to achievement, independence, and productivity, and it forces her to see herself, and others, as worthy of love simply because they exist, not because of what they can do. Kate also delves into the complexities of romantic love in crisis, particularly her relationship with her husband, Tobin, who has become not just her partner but her caregiver, her emotional anchor, and often, the silent container for her sorrow. She writes honestly about the strain illness places on intimacy, not just physical but emotional, the way grief, anger, and fear can distort communication, create distance, and threaten to overwhelm even the strongest bonds. Yet through that darkness she also reveals the quiet heroism of love that stays, love that doesn't always know what to say but still shows up, that makes tea, holds hands, picks up prescriptions, and keeps choosing to remain. It's a love that is less about perfection or passion and more about faithfulness, about saying I'm here, over and over again, even when things are falling apart. Kate also reflects on how motherhood reshapes her understanding of love, particularly in the face of her possible absence from her son's future. She writes with aching beauty about the everyday joys of parenting, changing diapers, hearing him laugh, watching him run, and the unbearable grief of imagining all the milestones she might miss. This love, fierce and maternal, fuels her desire to survive even as she tries to make peace with the reality that she may not. Her love for her son becomes a source of strength and heartbreak all at once, a reminder of what is most precious and what is most at risk. In the midst of all this, Kate also considers the love she feels from God, or perhaps more accurately, the love she is beginning to recognize in new ways. No longer the God of certainty or promises, this is the God who remains present even when answers are absent, who does not prevent suffering but enters into it alongside her. She no longer experiences God as a distant orchestrator but as a quiet companion, offering presence instead of protection. It's in the silence, in the waiting, in the broken prayers that she begins to feel divine love not as something that fixes, but something that holds, a gentle, persistent whisper that she is not alone. As the chapter unfolds, it becomes clear that love in the dark is not a metaphor but a lived reality, love that grows deeper in the absence of light, that is proven not in words but in presence, and that offers no explanations but endless companionship. Kate's writing, laced with humor and heartbreak, shows that love is not the absence of fear or sadness but the decision to keep reaching for one another despite them. In a world that often values strength, independence, and solutions, this chapter offers a counter-narrative. That weakness can be holy, that needing others is not failure but connection, and that love at its best is not shiny or performative but humble, gritty, and enduring. By the end of the chapter, Kate has not emerged from the darkness with answers, but she has found a kind of light within it, the warm, flickering glow of being seen, held, and loved not in spite of her brokenness but within it. Love in the dark is a testament to the human capacity to give and receive love even when everything else has been stripped away, and a quiet affirmation that this love, messy, faithful, imperfect, is what makes life not just bearable but beautiful. Chapter 6, Living in the In-Between. Kate Bowler brings readers into the unsettling, surreal space that exists between the life she used to have and the future she no longer dares to envision, a place where time stretches and shrinks unpredictably, where clarity and confusion coexist, and where the illusion of control has fully dissolved into the raw unpredictability of illness and mortality. This in-between is not a metaphor, it's the literal, emotional, and spiritual space she inhabits after her stage 4 cancer diagnosis, where she is neither fully dying nor truly healed, neither able to move forward with long-term plans nor fully capable of living in the moment without fear creeping in. Bowler reveals how this liminal zone challenges every part of her identity, as a mother, wife, scholar, and believer. It is a place where the future feels like a fragile thread that could snap at any time, and so she's constantly balancing the desperate desire to hope with the need to protect herself from more heartbreak. She describes this psychological space as a suspended reality, one where she can't fully grieve what she's lost because she's still here, but she can't confidently celebrate what remains because she doesn't know how long it will last. The routines of daily life become acts of both resistance and surrender. Brushing her son's hair, preparing a meal, sitting on the porch with her husband. These become sacred rituals in a life that no longer feels linear. She grapples with questions most people don't ask until much later in life, if ever. How do you parent when you may not see your child grow up? How do you love your spouse with everything you have while knowing you may be leaving them alone? How do you continue building a life when your foundations are shaking beneath you? Kate does not pretend to have clean answers. Instead, she writes from the messy middle where she learns to hold conflicting truths at once. Joy and grief, faith and doubt, courage and terror. The in-between forces her to become fluent in uncertainty, to stop demanding clarity from the universe and instead begin practicing what she calls the theology of the everyday. That is, learning to find meaning not in grand spiritual epiphanies or future goals, but in the smallest, realest things. The feel of her child's skin, the sound of laughter, the kindness of a friend, the absurdity of a moment. She confronts how deeply Western culture, and especially American Christianity, fears this ambiguity, always craving happy endings, spiritual lessons, or neat explanations, and how much pressure there is to transform suffering into personal growth. But Bowler resists this impulse, insisting that sometimes, the most honest and faithful thing a person can do is simply live in the in-between without trying to solve it, name it, or conquer it. She compares herself to those stuck between diagnosis and cure, between marriage and divorce, between beginning and ending, a whole world of people living suspended lives that don't fit into social scripts. And in doing so, she cultivates compassion for the quiet suffering others carry, the private limbos that never make it into conversation but define how people move through the world. She speaks about time as a strange, distorted force in this space. Days stretch out endlessly in hospital waiting rooms, while whole months seem to disappear between scans and treatments, each test result like a lottery ticket for life or death. Time becomes both a thief and a gift, and Bowler wrestles with how to inhabit it well. Rather than offer a resolution, she instead opens herself up to the wisdom of limitation. She comes to understand that living in the in-between doesn't mean waiting passively for something to change. It means learning to live fully without guarantees, to love deeply while knowing loss is inevitable, and to accept that life's meaning isn't found in certainty but in presence. She tells stories of moments where she is surprised by grace, a friend's unexpected visit, a stranger's note, a burst of uncontrollable laughter at something absurd, and these glimmers remind her that the in-between is not a void, but a space teeming with quiet, complicated life. Kate also touches on how institutions, medical, religious, academic, often fail people who are in the in-between, because systems prefer categories: sick or well, faithful or lost, productive or broken. But she makes space for a third way, for the people who are sort of okay, and sort of not, who carry grief in one hand and gratitude in the other. This is perhaps where her voice is strongest, when she gives permission to feel what is true, not what is expected. She allows space for people to cry without needing to justify it, to laugh without guilt, to live without pretending to know how things will turn out. In this chapter, Bowler begins to find a new kind of peace, not the peace that comes from having answers, but the peace that comes from learning to be gentle with herself, from trusting that love can hold her even when she can't hold everything together. She honors the courage it takes just to keep going, to show up for one more scan, one more bedtime story, one more day. Living in the in-between becomes less about suffering and more about attention, paying close attention to what is still possible, what still brings joy, what still connects her to the world. It's a chapter about making meaning in real time, not after the fact, and recognizing that even without resolution, life can still be beautiful, rich, and holy. By the end, she hasn't solved the tension of the in-between, but she has embraced it as a real and valid place to live, a place where faith is quieter but deeper, where hope is fragile but still flickering, and where love, as always, is the only thing that feels solid. In this suspended space between despair and healing, Bowler models a grace-filled way of being that makes room for the mess, the mystery, and the sacredness of simply enduring. Chapter 7: Letting Go. Kate Bowler confronts one of the most agonizing, yet spiritually profound experiences of living with a terminal illness. The process of surrender, letting go of the life she planned, the person she thought she'd be, and the illusion that if she tried hard enough, believed deeply enough, or was good enough, she could outmaneuver suffering. In this raw, reflective chapter, Kate reveals how tightly she had once gripped the story of her own life, with its carefully mapped-out expectations, achievements, and the belief that effort and faith would yield blessings. But now, as cancer dismantles every structure of predictability she clung to, she is forced into a space of radical unmaking. A space where the future is no longer hers to mold, where time is not promised, and where control is exposed as a myth. She speaks of grief not only for the potential loss of her life, but also for all the roles she may never fully inhabit again. The scholar in the prime of her academic career, the mother who gets to attend every soccer game, the wife who builds a long shared life. Letting go, she explains, is not a moment. It is a slow, relentless unraveling of attachment to the false promises our culture makes about health, success, and fairness. It is not passive or weak, but a courageous and conscious act of loosening her grip on what cannot be guaranteed, and choosing instead to live in the sacred now. She reflects on how deeply the prosperity gospel, though intellectually rejected, had shaped her subconscious. The idea that if she did life right, she could earn protection, health, or safety. But illness shattered that framework. Now, letting go means abandoning spiritual formulas and accepting mystery, where God is no longer a vending machine of blessings but a quiet presence in the suffering. Kate resists the idea that she must let go of hope entirely, but she redefines it, not as a belief in a specific outcome, but as the willingness to stay open to beauty, to connection, to love, even when outcomes are unclear. She writes tenderly about letting go of the future she imagined with her son, and how that grief is so deep it sometimes feels like drowning, yet she remains present for every sticky hug, every bedtime story, anchoring herself in the moments they still have. Letting go in this way becomes a paradox. It's not about giving up, but about releasing the need for certainty while still fiercely loving what is. She acknowledges that letting go doesn't mean detachment. It means holding more lightly, loving more freely, and trusting that even if life doesn't unfold as she wanted, it still holds meaning. She also unpacks the fear of becoming invisible or irrelevant if she loosens her grip on her old identity, her productivity, her public self. But she learns that identity is not solely defined by what she achieves. It's found in being, in presence, in how deeply she allows herself to connect, even in weakness. The chapter weaves between spiritual struggle and emotional surrender, where Kate confesses her resistance to the platitudes people often offer, just let go and let God, or God has a plan, which feel hollow in the face of real suffering. True letting go, she insists, is not about adopting a peaceful facade but about walking through fire and refusing to lie about how much it burns. Yet even in the pain, she begins to experience a new kind of peace, not the peace that erases pain, but the one that sits beside it without needing to fix it. She finds sacredness in letting go of the performance of being okay, in being honest with herself and with others about how fragile she feels, how scared, how exhausted. And in that honesty, she is met with more authentic love than she ever expected. Not the love that demands strength, but the love that says, "You're enough even now." This chapter also reflects deeply on community and the challenge of letting go of others' expectations. She writes about how people often struggle to see her as anything other than the version of her that was whole, and how she sometimes plays into that image out of guilt or habit. But slowly she gives herself permission to be seen in her brokenness, not as someone inspiring or tragic but as human. Letting go of the pressure to inspire allows her to simply be, without needing her pain to be redemptive or instructive. She talks about how her relationship with God has changed through this surrender, not a God who prevents bad things, but a God who suffers alongside her, who does not demand endurance but offers companionship. This divine presence doesn't give her answers but grants her the grace to say, "I don't know what will happen, but I am not alone." As the chapter closes, Kate returns to the idea that letting go is not a finish line but a continual, almost daily act of releasing what she cannot control, and choosing instead to embrace what she can. The sound of her child's laughter, the warmth of her husband's hand, the truth of a single beautiful moment. It's about letting go of the future without letting go of joy, letting go of certainty without letting go of trust, letting go of everything she thought she needed to be happy and discovering, somehow, that love still remains. She ends with a sense of quiet strength, not because she has mastered surrender, but because she now sees it not as defeat, but as a kind of grace. In letting go, she finds space to live, not in fear of what she might lose, but in gratitude for what she still has. And in this sacred release, she discovers a strange and tender freedom, the freedom to be fully alive, even in the shadow of death. Conclusion. In the conclusion of Everything Happens for a Reason, and Other Lies I've Loved, Kate Bowler offers a closing reflection that is both deeply personal and universally resonant, capturing the essence of her journey through suffering, faith, loss, and unexpected grace, while leaving readers with a hard-won wisdom that neither denies pain nor strips it of meaning. The final chapter is not a summation in the traditional sense, but more of an offering, a meditation on how one might continue to live meaningfully, even when life refuses to make sense. After enduring a devastating stage 4 cancer diagnosis, the unraveling of her professional and personal plans, the confrontation with mortality, and the dismantling of long-held spiritual assumptions, Bowler emerges not with neat answers or tidy theological conclusions, but with an honest, raw understanding of what it means to be human in a world where suffering is not optional and where control is ultimately an illusion. She makes it clear that this is not a triumph story wrapped in a bow, but rather a testimony to living with open hands in the face of unfixable things. The conclusion circles back to the book's title and central theme, the seductive idea that everything happens for a reason, and gently but firmly dismantles it, not in anger but in love, showing how such phrases, often meant to comfort, can instead silence grief, minimize pain, and place impossible burdens on those already suffering. Kate reminds us that while humans crave explanations, especially in the midst of tragedy, real healing begins when we release our addiction to certainty and instead choose compassion, presence, and truth. She writes about how she no longer needs a spiritual system that promises protection in exchange for faithfulness, nor a life philosophy that treats pain as a test she must pass or a puzzle she must solve. Instead, she embraces a spirituality that is humble, tender, and rooted in the sacredness of ordinary moments. The feel of her son's small hand in hers, the laughter shared with a friend, the kindness of a stranger who brings soup without asking questions. She finds herself softened rather than hardened by her suffering, more empathetic toward others, more willing to sit with people in their own darkness without trying to fix them. She emphasizes that while pain does not always produce clarity, it can produce connection. We do not need to understand or explain someone's suffering in order to walk beside them in it. And perhaps, she suggests, that is the deepest kind of love, the willingness to remain present with others when their lives are falling apart, without needing to tidy the edges or insert meaning where there is only mystery. The conclusion also reflects on her continued uncertainty about the future. Her health still fragile, her life still unpredictable, and yet she resists the urge to live in fear. Instead, she speaks of choosing gratitude without denying grief, of building a life that is not about milestones and guarantees but about moments. This life, she now understands, does not need to be spectacular to be beautiful. She extends this realization beyond herself, encouraging readers to embrace the lives they have, even when they are not the lives they planned, to hold their brokenness not as a flaw, but as a space where love can enter. In her characteristically wry, warm tone, she acknowledges that she once believed she could outwork or outbelieve suffering, and now she sees that the real miracle isn't in avoiding pain, but in not being undone by it. Her faith, once so dependent on clear doctrines and achievable outcomes, has shifted into something deeper, more mysterious, and more merciful, a God who does not prevent hardship but who never leaves her alone in it. And that presence, she writes, is enough, not to erase the ache but to carry her through it. She urges readers to reject the toxic positivity that demands constant optimism and instead cultivate honesty, vulnerability, and a fierce kind of hope that makes room for tears and silence and unresolved endings. In the end, the conclusion is not just a personal farewell or a summing up. It's a blessing. Kate blesses the broken-hearted, the uncertain, the tired, the ones sitting in waiting rooms and reading test results and trying to believe that they still matter, even when they feel diminished. She extends love to those who feel invisible in their pain and reminds them that they are not alone. She honors those who have loved deeply and lost profoundly, those who carry unseen burdens, and those who continue on despite it all. Her final words are not a proclamation of victory, but an invitation to live gently with ourselves and others, to resist the pressure to be strong when we are falling apart, and to believe that even in the absence of answers, there can still be beauty, meaning, and grace. The conclusion of everything happens for a reason leaves the reader not with platitudes, but with presence, not with closure but with courage to keep going, to keep loving, and to keep showing up for life, even when it doesn't go according to plan. It is a testament to the strength found in vulnerability, the wisdom found in unknowing, and the holiness of simply staying close to what is real. In closing, Bowler doesn't offer a reason for everything that happened, but she offers something better: the assurance that we are not alone, and that love, in its most resilient and humble form, is enough to carry us through the deepest unknowns.